session, we will be talking about preserving tomatoes. My name is Lauren Patterson, and I'm the Family and Consumer Science Extension Agent in Robertson County. And then also here with us today presenting is Whitney Danhoff, and she's the Family and Consumer Science Extension Agent in Bedford County. She'll be talking about salsa with us today, and we're going to get started with talking about how to preserve tomatoes safely. So today I'm going to be talking about with you how to acidify tomatoes and then also how to can tomatoes safely. So let's get started just thinking about those tomatoes. So maybe you have a garden, maybe you're visiting your local farmer's market. Hopefully you're getting to enjoy some of those delicious fresh tomatoes this summer. So the quote that we have today says, "It's difficult to think about anything but pleasant thoughts while eating a homegrown tomato." And I know for a lot of people, eating a tomato takes you back to summer, maybe takes you back to your childhood and being home during the summers and eating some of those fresh produce. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to eat one of those tomatoes that's been ripened in the hot summer sun. It's really delicious. So we're going to talk about how we can them safely and enjoy them all year long by maintaining the best quality. So let's get started with a little bit of background about canning and about food preservation. So we want to can foods safely so they don't spoil during storage or make us sick. Microorganisms of concern for home food preserved foods include mold, yeast, and bacteria. And these are the most common sources of microorganisms that are in the soil and in the water. So it's easy to see how they can get on our food because we're watering our food, it's growing in the soil. So it's easy to see how our food can get these. So mold is this first picture on the left, and it's a spoilage organism that's most frequently recognized by fuzzy growth on foods. And mold can be dangerous for individuals who are sensitive or even allergic to mold. The second one that's right in the middle is yeast. So yeast are also spoilage organisms, and they can grow over a wide range of pH and at refrigeration temperatures. So they can produce a slimy, spoilage or souring, or even a greening, and it produces a fruity or yeast odor and also gas formation. Bacteria, that's on the far right, is a microscopic organism, and it can also cause spoilage and make us sick. They spoil food by creating abnormal odors, clouding liquids, and sometimes they produce a gas that can cause your jars to swell and burst. And they can also make us very sick. So many of the spoilage organisms that you see that's on food, you can see. So usually you can see mold as it's growing. But the extreme temperatures in canning will destroy most microorganisms that make us sick and cause food spoilage. The exception is this one on the screen, Clostridium botulinum. And unfortunately, this bacteria can't be seen or tasted. So this bacteria grows and produces a toxin that affects our nervous system and can lead to paralysis and even death. So this is really serious. But why is this bacteria such a problem specifically in canned foods? Well, the reason is because this Clostridium botulinum grows in a vacuum. And that's what's created whenever we can food. We're driving out that oxygen. It also grows in food with less acidity. So it doesn't grow where there's enough acid. And then it also grows at room temperature, which is where we're storing our canned foods. It's not a problem in refrigerated or frozen foods. So how can we can tomatoes safely? And the key to this, or one of the keys to it, is acidity. So we're going to start off by talking about how to acidify those tomatoes. So acidity is one of the ways we can control the growth of bacterium like that botulism that can be in canned foods. So the pH scale, which is what you see on your screen, it goes from 0 to 14, measures how acidic or basic a substance is. A pH of 7 is right in the middle, and that's neutral. A pH less than 7 is acidic. And in order to prevent Clostridium botulinum from growing and producing a dangerous toxin, the pH must be at or below 4.6. So keep in mind 4.6 is our marker here. That's where we kind of draw the line. So high acid and acidified foods can be safely canned in a water bath canner. So jams, jellies, fruits, all of those things are naturally high in acid. Pickled foods, which we'll talk more about next month, need to have an acid such as vinegar added to them to make them more acidic so that they can be processed in a water bath canner. So foods with enough acid, 4.6 or below, inhibit the growth of Clostridium botulinum. So what about tomatoes? Are tomatoes a high acid or a low acid food? So I'll give you a minute and kind of think about that. Do you think that they're low acid below 4.6 or a higher acid? So this one's a little bit of a trick. So tomatoes are more acidic than meats and vegetables, but they're less acidic than most fruit. So their acidity is really kind of in between. So tomatoes typically fall between 4 and 5 on that pH scale. And remember, we're looking for 4.6 or below. So low acid foods, like the green beans you see there in the picture, need to be processed in a pressure canner in order to reach a temperature of at least 240 degrees. Acid foods, so keep in mind those fruits and things like that, can be processed in a boiling water canner that reaches a temperature of 212 degrees. So tomatoes can actually be processed in either type of canner because they are acidic enough to inhibit the growth of that Clostridium botulinum bacteria. However, recent research shows some products, pressure canning will actually result in a higher quality and more nutritious product. But do keep in mind, we'll talk about some different tomato recipes, but keep in mind that if a recipe specifies that it has to be pressure canned, that it has to be pressure canned. It's only safe if it's pressure canned, and that's usually because there's low acid ingredients that are involved in that. So since we know that tomatoes are usually around, 4, 5, somewhere around that 4.6, how do we know if our tomatoes are acidic enough? So there's a lot of different varieties of tomatoes. If you've been to the farmer's market, you'll see that there's usually different booths and different tomatoes, and they're all lined up. They all look a little bit different. Maybe they're different colors. So there's a lot of different varieties. And research shows that there's also various acidity levels as well. One North Dakota study tested the pH of 15 varieties of raw tomatoes, and they found the pH varied from 4.8 to 5.2. Now keep in mind, our goal is 4.6 or below. So there's a common belief among gardeners that older varieties of tomatoes are more acidic than newer hybrids, but the opposite has actually been shown. Researchers at Utah State found that heirloom varieties that they tested actually had less acid than the hybrids. So using heirloom tomatoes doesn't guarantee that they are acidic enough. So let's talk a little bit about those heirloom tomatoes. I feel like personally these have gotten more popular in the last few years, and you see a lot of gardeners that are starting to grow more of these. You see more of these popping up at the farmer's market. Instead of those, perfect round red ones, we're starting to see a variety of shapes and colors. So let's talk a little bit about these. So an heirloom tomato is an open pollinated variety that has been passed down at least 50 years through several generations in a family, ethnic, religious, or tribal group, or it can also be a tomato that was commercially introduced before 1940. So seeds from open pollinated varieties produce offspring that are identical to the parent. If you prevent cross-pollination, seeds can be saved that will produce identical tomatoes year after year. Heirloom seeds come from one cultivar. Hybrid seeds come from a combination of different cultivars. So after World War II, after major developments were made in highway and railroad systems, think about the interstate system and things like that, we were able to ship produce great distances. This increased the desire for tomatoes from warmer regions with longer growing seasons, which makes sense. If you can get a tomato, later in the season, then you want to do that. You want to have access to that. Tomatoes were fragile, which I think we all know that they can be fragile, and they tasted good, but they just didn't ship well. So scientists began major tomato breeding to get a tomato of uniform size and shape and with thicker skin so it could withstand shipping better. More changes in breeding produced brighter red colors, varieties that ripened at the same time, and types that were adaptable to mechanical harvesting, and those that would develop resistance to disease and pests. Consumers began to complain that market tomatoes and even the hybrids available to home gardeners had lost their flavor. So I think about, buying tomatoes at the grocery store in the winter. They're just not quite the same as those fresh summer tomatoes. So interest arose in reviving the tasty old varieties to plant in home gardens. With the increased interest in old varieties, seed-saving organizations with seed banks became popular, and seed companies began growing heirloom seeds for specialty catalogs. As availability of heirloom seeds increased, small farmers began growing heirloom tomatoes for local farmers markets. So that kind of brings us up to date where we are now. So we know that different varieties affect the acidity of tomatoes, but there's other conditions that affect acidity as well. And so that really makes determining which tomatoes are more acidic difficult. Some things that affect the acidity are disease, if the tomato plant has a disease, the condition of the vines, the amount of sun and rainfall, the maturity of the tomato. So acid begins to decrease in overly mature tomatoes, and then also processing conditions all affect acidity. So what do we do about that? If we don't really know the acidity of our tomatoes, then how can we make sure that they're safe to can? So in 1994, USDA recommended that home food preservers add an acidifying agent such as lemon juice or citric acid because, as a rule, consumers don't know the specific pH of the tomatoes that they grow or buy. So when you can tomatoes, add either the bottled lemon juice or the citric acid. And you'll see here in the middle, there's some fresh lemons with a big X over them. And we don't recommend squeezing fresh lemons because, again, the acidity of the lemons themselves can vary. However, the acidity in the bottled lemon juice is much more consistent. So we recommend using the bottled lemon juice or that citric acid to add acid to those tomatoes to make sure that they're safe. So this next part is really important. So you should add acid whether you are using a boiling water canner or a pressure canner. And this is because all pressure canning recipes with tomatoes have had acid added. So when they tested those recipes, all of them had acid added to them. So we don't know if it's safe to leave out the acid when pressure canning tomatoes using the same process time as used for acidified tomatoes. So I know we talked about, you have to have that low pH when you're using the water bath canner, but when you are canning tomatoes, you want to add acid to all of it, no matter if you're planning to pressure can or water bath can. And that's because that's how it's been tested when they test recipes to make sure they're safe. So there are many ways to can tomatoes, so many different ways to do it. They can be canned whole, quartered, crushed. They can be packed in water, tomato juice. They can be packed raw without added liquids. They can be canned as juice. We also have tested processes for tomato sauce, tomatoes with okra or zucchini, spaghetti sauce without meat, spaghetti sauce with meat, tomato ketchup, tomato paste, hot sauce, and barbecue sauce. And there's even a process for tomatillos as well. So there are so many different ways to can tomatoes. So we're gonna go into now the process for preparing those canned tomatoes. So we talked about, acidifying, we talked about the safety, how to make sure that product is safe. So now we're going to go into the steps and some background information on preparing those canned tomatoes, whether they're crushed, whole, or halved. So this is some good background information to have before you go and purchase those tomatoes, or if you're using tomatoes from your garden. This kind of tells you how much you need to be able to process that. So in canning tomatoes, for 7 quarts, you need about 21 pounds of tomatoes. For 9 pints, you need about 13 pounds of tomatoes. And then keep in mind, a bushel weighs 53 pounds and yields 15 to 21 quarts. And so that's an average of about 3 pounds per quart. And also regular tomatoes work well for juice and canned tomatoes as well. Now, paste tomatoes. So you may have seen these little small Roma tomatoes, or sometimes they're called plum tomatoes. They're not quite as round, they're a little more oblong sometimes. So some recipes may include a specific type of tomato called a paste tomato. So paste tomatoes may also be called plum tomatoes because of their elongated shape, or Italian tomatoes. Roma tomatoes are paste potatoes, and they're called paste potatoes because they have thick balls and small seeds. So they work well for cooking in salsas, ketchups, purees, because they cook into a thick sauce. Regular and paste tomatoes can also be mixed together. So maybe you have a recipe that uses both of them, and that's safe to do. I also mentioned tomatillos a few minutes ago. So this is another type of tomato. It's also known as the Mexican husk tomato, and it's a fruit in the nightshade family, and it is small, round, and green, or sometimes they're kind of a greenish purple color. And they look like unripe tomatoes, but they also have a dry leafy husk, and you can kind of see that in that picture there. It's kind of papery. When you select these, pick those that have a dry and papery husk. They will feel a little firmer than other tomatoes, and they can be cooked, used raw in salads, or often you see them used in salsa. So green tomatoes. I know a lot of us, we think about green tomatoes, we think about fried green tomatoes, but you can also can green tomatoes. They are more acidic than ripe tomatoes, but you should still follow the same instructions that you use for ripe tomatoes. So still add that acid, still go through all the steps. All right, for preparation. The first thing you're going to do, as with anything, is you're going to wash your tomatoes to get started. And then to help you be able to get the skins off, what you can do is you can dip in boiling water for 30 to 60 seconds until the skins split, and then dip in cold water. And then that should help you. You can see in the picture up in the top right corner, that can help you be able to just kind of slip those skins off. They kind of just almost come apart from it. And so that can help you, and then you're able to remove the core. So we talked about acidifying the tomatoes. We know we have to do that. So how do we do that? How much do we add? So we add lemon juice or citric acid to each jar, not to the entire pot. And to ensure safe acidity in whole, crushed, or juiced tomatoes, you add 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice. Remember, the bottled has a more consistent pH than fresh. Or you can add half a teaspoon of citric acid per quart of tomatoes. For pints, you can use 1 tablespoon of lemon juice or 1/4 of a teaspoon per pint. So acid can be added directly to the jars before filling with your product, before filling with your tomatoes. And you can add sugar to offset the acid taste if you want to. 4 tablespoons of 5% acidity vinegar per quart can also be used instead of lemon juice or citric acid. However, we know that vinegar has kind of a strong flavor sometimes. So that may cause some undesirable flavor changes. So just keep that in mind. And what about salt? So salt is completely optional. It's not used for preserving the tomatoes. It's only for flavor. And it's, keep in mind, the process that actually preserves the tomatoes, not necessarily the ingredients in it. Okay, so you have your tomatoes ready. So let's talk about some different ways that you can can these. So the first type is a hot pack. So this is when you're going to boil the tomatoes gently for 5 minutes, and then you add the hot tomatoes in hot jars, which is why it's called a hot pack. You're going to cover the tomatoes with either hot water or tomato juice. Remember to remove those air bubbles, wipe your rims, and then leave a 1/2 inch headspace and apply your lids. And then for the raw pack, so you're going to pack your jars with raw peeled tomatoes, cover them either with juice, water, or no liquid at all. If you're not adding liquid, you want to press down on the tomatoes with a spoon until spaces between them fill with juice. Again, remove your air bubbles, leave a 1/2 inch headspace, so same as the hot pack, wipe your rims, and then apply your lids. So do keep in mind that not all products have process times for both hot and raw packs. If there's only a process for hot pack, then you have to do the hot pack. You can't raw pack them. So either the process time has not been established for a raw pack or the food isn't suitable for a raw pack. So keep in mind, we always want to follow those tested recipes. We don't want to go rogue and do our own thing because it may not be safe. So once you have your jars ready for processing, you can choose a boiling water bath or the pressure canner. So this is a chart, and there's kind of a lot going on here, but this shows how preparation affects how long it takes to process tomatoes. When tomatoes are canned whole or half packed in tomato juice or no liquid, it takes 85 minutes to process in the water bath canner, in 25 minutes in the pressure canner. So you can see that at the bottom of the screen, the bottom two on the chart. These times, keep in mind, are at an altitude of 0 to 1,000 feet. And we'll talk about in a minute how altitude affects things. But compare this to only 35 minutes when tomatoes are crushed and 40 minutes when whole or halves are packed in water. The denser the food, the longer it takes to process. So this is one reason you do not want to pack foods too tightly when you use a hot pack. It makes the product more dense and harder for a high enough temperature to reach all the food inside the jar. And then raw packed food can be packed tighter than a hot packed food because it will shrink. But you always want to leave the correct amount of headspace, so that's a 1/2 inch, so that the food will process adequately and form a good seal. And I'll give you a minute. You can kind of just look over the chart for a minute. Keep in mind that it's broken up into pints and quarts because that can affect the process time. All right, so I mentioned altitude. So Tennessee has lots of hills and mountains over in the eastern part. So some counties in Tennessee, depending on where you are, may have areas where elevations do exceed 1,000 feet. So when you boil water at a higher altitude, it boils at a lower temperature. So therefore, it is important for safety that you add additional processing time. For example, if you process your tomatoes at altitudes from 1,000 to 6,000 feet, you will need to add an additional 5 minutes or more to the processing time depending on your altitude. And you can usually find information about changes that you need to make on those tested recipes. They'll usually kind of give you reminders about that. So this depends on your altitude and your location. And then also for pressure canners, If you're using a dial gauge, increase the pounds of pressure at altitudes over 2,000 feet. So process at 12, 13, or 14 pounds, depending on your altitude. And then in a weighted gauge canner, increase pressure to 15 pounds when altitude is greater than 1,000 feet. The processing time stays the same, but the pressure increases for the pressure canners. So we prepared our tomatoes, we packaged them, we've processed them, they are ready to go. Now, what about storing them? So after you've removed your jars from the canner, you want to let them sit undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours, and then check the seals. You can kind of push down on the lid. If they spring back, they're not sealed. So tomatoes can be reprocessed within 24 hours. So if you press on that seal and it's popped in, it's good to go. But if it springs back, it's not popped in, then you can reprocess that as long as you're within that 24 hours. But you do want to use a new lid. So once they're sealed, you can remove the rings, and this will prevent them from rusting during storage, and also make it easier for you to see if there's any spoilage. And then you can rinse the jars to remove any food residue on the outside. Make sure you label your jars. That's really important. You're going to want to label it with the contents. So if you have crushed tomatoes, you want to make sure you write crushed tomatoes, write the date that you process that. And then if you are doing multiple canner loads, then you can also write the lot on there as well. And this will help you spot the jars. If a jar in a canner load spoils, it'll help you know what other jars were in that canner load with it. So like with all canned things, we recommend storing in a clean, cool, dry place because heat will cause canned food to lose quality in just a few weeks. Otherwise, your canned tomatoes should last for a year. So a good rule of thumb is to only can what you can eat in a year. And if you just love canning, then you feel free to pass that along to others because I know others appreciate that as well. And it's, as probably everyone here knows, it can be a lot of work to can things. So just a few do's and don'ts before we wrap up on the tomatoes. Do use quart or smaller jars for canning all tomato products. Do not can tomato juice in half-gallon jars. Half-gallon jars are only safe for canning apple or grape juice. Do follow tested recipes, like I've mentioned several times. Do not make up your own recipes for salsa, spaghetti sauce, or pizza sauce. And I know Whitney's going to talk more about salsa in just a minute. Do use the same amount of low acid ingredients as the tested recipe specifies. So don't add any extra low acid ingredients. You also want to make sure you measure those ingredients accurately. And keep in mind that's because we're worried about that pH. We have to keep that pH at a safe level. So don't just use extra onion to finish off what you have. So, you know, sometimes when you're cooking, you have just a little bit of onion left, go ahead and chop it up and add it anyways. With canning, not safe to do because, again, we're worried about that acid. You can reduce or omit a low acid ingredient like garlic in tomato sauce recipes. And do use thickeners for tomato products when ready to serve, but you don't want to add thickeners or milk before processing. All right, and then I've already mentioned the using the same amount of low acid ingredients. Don't add extra to that. And then don't add more than 3 cups of any combination of finely chopped celery, onions, carrots, and pepper for each 22 pounds, which is 7 quarts, when making tomato vegetable juice blends. And then finally, I know this is a common thing that we see a lot, and that's sometimes that yellow layer that can be in cans. So if you've ever noticed that that it's kind of separated a little bit, maybe there's kind of a yellowish clear layer, and then there's the red layer. This is due to the enzymes that are found naturally in tomatoes when they're allowed to sit at room temperature. So after you've canned your tomatoes or on the shelf, they're being stored for later in the year when you don't have access to those fresh tomatoes. There's an enzyme in there that starts to break down the pectin in the tomatoes. And so this results in that yellow kind of tinted liquid that can be at the top or bottom of the jar. The tomatoes are still safe to eat, but there's a few things you can do to try to prevent it or maybe minimize that separation a little bit. That's choosing a high quality tomato, using a hot pack instead of a raw pack, and then heating the tomatoes immediately after peeling and cutting. So not letting them just sit around for a while, so heating them immediately. If you see it in tomato juice, one thing you can do is try squeezing rather than blending the tomatoes into the juice. And then also cutting, crushing, or blending the tomatoes can cause the pulp and the liquid to separate. So you want to tear them into quarters with your hands and immediately add them to the pot and heat, which is that hot pack method. So that's hopefully, if that's something that you've come across, you've run into, maybe you've seen it, it's still safe, but it's just due to those enzymes breaking down the pectin, and that's what can cause it. All right, so I hope that you have gained a lot of information. I know this is a lot of information at one time. We do have lots of resources available for you to be able to look back over all of this and have more of a handy guide as you're actually selecting and preparing and processing your tomato products. So I hope you enjoy your tomato products. You're able to use them all year long. I'm going to hand it over to Whitney now. She's going to talk about salsas.
All right, so there are lots of products that we can make using tomatoes. And so one of those really popular products is salsa. So we're going to talk a little bit about salsa. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we're going to talk about types of salsas here. So there are lots of different types of salsa that we can make. So one type is a pico de gallo, and people often think of this when they think of salsa. This is a salsa fresca, or a fresh sauce, and it's tomatoes, onions, peppers, cilantro, and seasonings, and then it has lime juice in it. And usually we eat this with chips, or we put it on tacos or whatever. And this is an uncooked salsa. So this is not suitable to can, even though it has a lot of the similar ingredients. When we cook that and hot pack it and then process it, it is not going to retain its texture, and it will not be a pico de gallo at that point. So when we talk about canning, we're talking about a cooked salsa. So it's tomatoes and onions and peppers and seasoning. So it's basically the same ingredients, but they are hot packed into jars and then processed. And so it ends up being a cooked salsa. So you can see in the picture there, the type of salsa that we're talking about that we're going to can. You can also make salsas with tomatillos. And so Lauren talked a little bit about the tomatillos. This is a salsa verde, or a green salsa. Like she said, they have this papery husk on them. When you remove that papery husk, the tomatillos often have a sticky substance on the outside, so you need to wash that really well. There is a tested recipe for a tomatillo salsa, and so you're going to follow that recipe. You do not have to peel the tomatillos, so the skin is tender enough that it doesn't need to be peeled. You're just going to chop it up. There are also other kinds of salsas. There are fruit salsas like mango salsa or cranberry salsa, and there are tested recipes for that. We're not going to focus on those today since we're talking about tomatoes, but there are recipes for those other types. Lauren also talked about the green tomatoes. And so if you want to replace the red tomatoes with green tomatoes to make a green salsa, you can do that because the green tomatoes are more acidic than the red ones. So that is a safe substitution to make. So if you want to make a green salsa, you can certainly do that. But all of these salsas, they must be hot packed for one thing. None of these are raw packed. They're all hot packed, and they are all processed in a water bath canner. So make sure that you do process them. Lauren talked a lot about acidifying tomatoes. Well, we need to do the same thing with the salsa. And it's even more important with the salsa because we are adding lots of low acid ingredients. So salsas involve the addition of peppers and onions and garlic, and all of these are low in acid. So in addition to the tomatoes being borderline, we're adding other things to it. So it has to be acidified in order to be safe. So again, you're going to do that either with commercially bottled vinegar or commercially bottled lemon juice or lime juice. And so those are the three that are used in salsa. And it uses quite a bit of these ingredients. So you do not want to reduce that. It is for the safety of the product. And so a lot of times canned salsas are more tart than a commercial salsa. But like Lauren said, you can add sugar to it to kind of offset that, or you can add the sugar after you open it and are using it. You can adjust it then. It is important to use a tested recipe so that the minimum amount of these acids to make the recipe as safe is known. So if a recipe calls for lemon juice or lime juice, you can substitute an equal amount of vinegar, 5% commercially bottled vinegar. Lemon juice and lime juice are more acidic than vinegar. You cannot replace lemon juice or lime juice. You cannot use vinegar in place of lemon or lime juice. So you can use lemon or lime juice in place of vinegar, but not vice versa. So generally you want to use what the recipe calls for. It's been tested that way. And it's also might affect the flavor of it as well. So preparing our salsa, let's talk about some of these ingredients. So Lauren talked about the different types of tomatoes. So it makes a difference in the consistency of the salsa that you're making. So the paste tomatoes have more flesh to them. So it's going to make a little bit of a thicker salsa. So we talked about not adding thickeners to any of these products, but if you want a little bit thicker salsa, then use the paste tomatoes instead of the slicing tomatoes. Slicing tomatoes will give you a little looser, a little more thinner, watery product. So it depends on the kind of salsa that you want to have and the way that you're going to use it. Always use a high quality tomato. Make sure that you don't use any tomatoes off of a frost killed vine or a dead vine. Bacteria can invade that and it can be a higher risk for spoilage. It can also reduce the acidity of it. So make sure that you're using high quality, best tomatoes. You'll also want to avoid draining or squeezing your tomatoes because you may remove some of the liquid and juices that you need and lose some of the acid in it. So you're going to chop them up, whether you're using paste tomatoes or slicing tomatoes, you're going to chop them up and add that with the juices and everything that come out of it. Don't squeeze them to remove that. Peeling the tomatoes, Lauren talked about this, putting them in boiling water for 30 to 60 seconds. They should peel right off, and that makes it a whole lot easier. So green tomatoes and tomatillos, you can use these in salsas. There's a tested recipe for the tomatillos. The green tomatoes can be used in place of the red tomatoes. If you do that, it may change the flavor of the salsa a little bit. So be aware of that. And you may really love the green tomato salsa, but you may not also. So you might want to experiment with making green tomato salsa and making red tomato salsa. Again, if you're using the green tomatoes, you do have to acidify it. You have to use the same amount of vinegar or lemon juice or lime juice that the recipe calls for, even if it's for a red tomato. So peppers, let's talk a little bit about the peppers that we're going to use. That's a main ingredient of salsa. We do not want to change the total amount that we use in a salsa. So peppers vary in their heat intensity. So you can substitute one type of pepper for another. So, and this includes bell peppers and hot chilies. You can also use canned chilies in place of fresh, but you just don't want to increase the total amount that you're using. So when using the same number of peppers, substitute peppers of the same size. So you don't want to use a recipe that calls for a pepper that's very small and use the same amount of a very large pepper. So you want to maintain the same amount and use peppers of the same size. When you're preparing your peppers, you do want to be a little careful. They do contain capsaicin, which is the ingredient that gives it heat. And so that can be very painful to your eyes if you get it in your eyes, or sometimes even on your hands. So we recommend that you wear plastic or rubber gloves while you're handling hot peppers, and do not touch your face or your eyes while you're wearing those gloves. So make sure that you wash your hands, even if you're wearing gloves, wash your hands before you touch your face after working with those hot peppers. So peppers don't usually need peeling. Most of the peppers have skins that are tender enough, and you're chopping them fairly small, so you won't need to peel them. However, the skin of long green chilies like Anaheim's can be tough after canning. And so there's a couple of methods that you can use to peel the peppers if you desire. So the first method is oven or broiler method. In this method, you either put it under the broiler or put the oven at 400 degrees. It'll take about 6 to 8 minutes. You want to get a nice char on the outside of it. You want the skin to blister a little bit. You can also do this directly on the range top. You can use a metal rack over the burner with a mesh, and then put the peppers directly on top of that, and rotate them and blister them on all of the sides. You can also do it on your grill outside, and you would do the same thing, just rotate them until they're blackened all the way around until the skin blisters. After they are blistered, no matter which method you use, you want to put them in a bowl or a pan and cover them with a damp cloth and let them steam just a little bit. And then it should be very easy to rub that skin off with a paper towel or the backside of a knife. You can use that as well. And then you're going to discard the seeds, and then you'll chop up your peppers. So there are lots of different levels of heat and lots of different types of peppers. So mild peppers include bell peppers. They have no significant heat in them. So if you are a person that you like the flavor of salsa, but you don't like all the heat, you can certainly use bell peppers, and that will be a very mild salsa. Banana peppers are also very mild. Underneath each of these pictures, it has the units. These are Scoville units. These are units that they use to determine the heat of a pepper. So banana peppers have 0 to 500. Anaheim peppers, if the recipe calls for a long green pepper, Anaheims or even the poblanos are good ones to use for that. They're a fairly mild pepper. They have 1,000 to 2,500. So more than a bell pepper, but they're not extremely hot. The next level, these are hot peppers. These include jalapenos, serrano peppers, and cayenne peppers. And so you can see they go anywhere from 2,500 Scoville units up to 50,000 units. So we're getting a little bit hotter here. You'll notice that these peppers are a little bit smaller. In general, the smaller the pepper, the hotter it is. And then you have really hot peppers. So if you like really hot salsa, you can use Scotch bonnet peppers or habanero peppers, which are kind of at the top level of the pepper heat scale. So onions are another main component of salsa. Again, they're a low acid ingredient, so you do not want to change the total amount of onions that you use in a recipe, but you can use any kind that you want. So you can use red onions, you can use yellow, or you can use white onions. Any of those are perfectly fine. And then salsa has spices and herbs added to create the flavor. And so you may have dried spices and herbs like oregano or dried pepper flakes or cumin. Sometimes it calls for fresh cilantro. Cilantro does tend to lose some of its flavor in the processing. And so a lot of people add the cilantro when they open the jar, and it will have a fresher, stronger cilantro flavor if you do that. This is the one area where you can change this up a little bit. So these dried spices, you can substitute one for another. So if you don't like cumin in your salsa, you can leave that out. Or if you like more cumin and a little bit less oregano, you can adjust those. You don't want to use more than the total amount that it calls for, but you could use less or leave it out, or you can substitute one for another. If you're using fresh herbs like cilantro, or garlic, you don't want to increase the amount as that's a low acid ingredient, and we don't want to increase that. So thickeners, a lot of times people that do home canned salsa, it's a little bit thinner usually than a commercial product. And so they're tempted to add thickeners to it. We do not want to do that. It affects the heat penetration. And so you don't want to add flour or cornstarch or any other kind of thickener. If you like a little bit thicker salsa, then try using the paste tomatoes instead of the slicing tomatoes when you're canning it. You can also, after it's processed and you're going to serve it, you can pour off some of the liquid at that point, and that will give you a thicker product. Or you can add those thickeners, you can add some cornstarch to it after you get it out of the jar and you're ready to serve it. So you can add the thickener then, but do not add any of those thickeners before you do your canning. So one of the most frequent questions we get is, may I use my own recipe for salsa? Everybody has their favorite recipe and they want to use their recipe to can. And the short answer to this is no. We've talked about why it is so important to have the right balance of low acid ingredients, the tomatoes, and then the acid that is added to it in order to make it safe. So you can't just take a recipe that you already have and use that. So if you like the taste of a certain salsa, I would go to the tested recipes and find a tested recipe that is as close to your home recipe as possible. So it may be a slightly different, so don't adjust it, but use a recipe that comes pretty close. In the tested recipes, there are some options. So you can adjust the type of pepper that you use. So you can make it hotter, you can make it less hot, and you have a little bit of adjustment that you can make in the dried spices. And so those are two areas that you can work within a tested recipe and get it closer to your regular recipe. So there are lots of resources that we have available. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and I'm going to take you to this bedford.tennessee.edu. This is where all of our resources for the Extension Explores Food Preservation items are stored. So I'm going to share this website very quickly here. So can you see the Bedford County website on there?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the bedford.tennessee.edu. If you look under Family Programs at the top and click on that, then you'll see Extension Explores Food Preservation. You're going to click on that, and these are all of the resources. So here's the schedule for the year, but then there is a page for each of the topics that we're going to cover. So there's a strawberry page that we did in May. In June, we did the green beans. And then today we did the tomatoes. So you're going to click on the tomato page. And there's some information at the top about tomatoes. But then down below, when you're looking for a tested recipe, these canning recipes on the left-hand side, and this is on each page, these are all of the tested recipes that are available online that we have extension publications or from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And so you can see that there are the different ways that you can can tomatoes. There are tomato sauces. If you're making tomato juice, there are 2 different kinds there. And then here are the tomato or tomatillo salsa recipes. There are jellied products that you can make with tomatoes. There are also pickled products and even pie filling. So all of those tested recipes are there. Then we have freezing recipes and other preservation recipes like drying tomatoes. And then there are videos. These are all related to salsa and tomatoes. And this is where we will put our program from today. And then on the right-hand side, you have general resources about canning and canning tomatoes, and then frequently asked questions down at the bottom. So a great resource. We hope that you utilize that and that you go to that website so that that is available to you. So we want to thank you for joining us today. We are going to stop recording.